for like 3 seconds and then get started. Hey everyone, welcome back to a special edition of the LlamaIndex Webinar series. This is Jerry here, and today we're joined by Dan Shiffer, founder and CEO of Every. Every is a newsletter publishing long-form essays at the intersection of business and tech, read by almost 100,000 founders, investors, and operators in tech. And Dan also writes a weekly column on AI called Chain of Thought. And so he's been very, very active in the AI space. I've gotten to know Dan in the past year, and it's been an awesome set of interactions. And so he was one of the first people I reached out to when OpenAI did their DevDay on Monday. We caught up at the event, and I asked, hey, do you want to be on my webinar on Friday to talk about just like high level trends, implications, like impacts of everything they've released on Monday. And so we'll talk about that in just a bit. And I think for the first like 10 to 15 minutes, we'll go over some of the just updates from the LlamaIndex side that we've shipped. We've shipped actually a ton of different things. We shipped like probably 5 to 10 different new features, analyses, and those things. And so we'll go over that, and then we'll spend probably like a solid 40-45 minutes on Q&A. If you have any questions on the chat, I have a set of like questions I'm just going to ask. But if you have any questions from the audience, just please drop it in, and then I will I'll just like interleave that throughout the panel. Great, let's get started. One sec. Great. So let's first kick it off by just talking about some of the things that we shipped in LlamaIndex post OpenAI DevDay. We're happy to do probably like a workshop on this at some point, just so that people understand like everything that we've done. But yeah, the entire Eng team has been hard at work doing a lot of things here. So a quick rundown through some high-level updates 5 days in since they released a bunch of features on Monday. One is they updated their Python and TypeScript library to V1, which ended up like the day of it, it broke a bunch of things. But basically within a few hours, we have full updated support for their new library. So this is very table stakes. You can still keep using LlamaIndex with the new OpenAI versions. Some other thing is some analysis on the JSON mode versus function calling. And basically, they released this thing called JSON mode. It seems pretty fancy. How is that actually different than function calling? How does it work under the hood? We support parallel function calling now for both agents as well as structured data extraction. One of the big new things was this like hosted agent API, like the assistant API, and we basically wrap that as an agent abstraction. And you can still plug in your own tools. There's a natural language. We came up with this like fun natural language interface for building your own agents, similar to how you build GPTs by programming it with natural language. We did some analysis of the GPT-4 context limit, and then also came up with some multimodal abstractions, LLMs, embeddings, indexing, and retrieval. I'm just going to run through some basic screenshots of some of these slides. This is pretty much all taken from our Twitter accounts. So my personal account as well as the LlamaIndex Twitter account. So this is just yeah, if you guys want like resources, links, feel free to give us a follow there. Okay. One initial thing we took a look at is okay, what exactly is JSON mode basically? They released it and it seemed like a big deal, but basically JSON mode is just a way to make sure that the output conforms to a JSON schema. What it does not do is it does not adhere to any schema that you specify. So you can tell it to adhere to this specific like Pydantic class, and it might not necessarily do that, but it will guarantee that the output is, or roughly guarantee that the output is JSON. The difference with function calling is that the way function calling works is you input some like argument spec, and then it'll extract out like a function call, which is basically a structured representation. Function calling uses JSON mode under the hood. I think there was a thread on OpenAI's blogs under the hood. And if you just take a look at trying to do structured data extraction just with JSON mode without the function calling part, you might get back, for instance, like valid JSON right here. Like here's like a call summary template, but the actual schema might not actually, like the actual extraction itself might not output some sort of like valid arguments. Right? So here, here's just a basic test we did. Here's like system prompt, user, you put in some transcript, and then try to make sure that the type is like JSON. It basically just regurgitates the schema that you specified and doesn't actually do extraction of values into the schema. The next item here is parallel function calling. So this is another just like general kind of like life upgrade from OpenAI, where instead of just like calling a single function at a time, it can call multiple functions. The two use cases that we see this happening is one in agents and second in structured data extraction. So for the first thing in agents is that now because it can pick multiple tools at a time, like you can basically do more efficient processing beyond just sequential chain of thought for every single action. This is quite important because a lot of like the types of questions you want to ask might require kind of like batching up the queries and executing them all at once. And this just leads to the faster, more parallel execution. So for instance, like if you ask our OpenAI agent, what's the weather like in SF, Tokyo, and Paris? The OpenAI agent basically is a function calling agent that just wraps the function calling API. You can now, in one turn, get all three values or execute all three queries, as opposed to doing it in sequential loops. It's also useful for structured data extraction. There's this whole thing about, if you define a Pydantic object, you can pass it in as a schema to the function schema to OpenAI function calling and try to get it to do structured data extraction. Now, you can basically more efficiently pass in a single object and get back an entire list of objects. So you just do, output class equals album, allow multiple equals true, and then you can just get back an entire set of albums. Before, you basically had to define kind of this hacky wrapper class, which is like, album list or something with a list of albums. And then that just wasted extra tokens and potentially caused OpenAI to get confused. So now it's a lot better that way. The next part is this assistant API, which is basically kind of like a hosted agent execution runtime, like under the hood. And we basically developed a light like wrapper abstraction that integrates with the API agents. So you can use like your built-in retrieval tool, you can use the built-in OpenAI retrieval tool or their code interpreter tool. But because the agent supports function calling, you can actually just plug in any sort of query tools you want from LlamaIndex. We support a wide variety of tools from basically all the query engine stuff like around our RAG concepts, as well as all the tools available on Llama Hub. This ranges from stuff like Gmail, Google Calendar, to like search APIs, database APIs, those things. So you can actually bring your own like vector store to use with the assistant API. You just basically have to define that as a tool. So instead of OpenAI calling its own retrieval tool, it just calls your tool, and then you just handle the execution. And the nice thing about LlamaIndex is we just handle that for you. So it integrates with pretty much all the vector databases that we have. There's been some general discussion, we'll get into this during the Q&A, of how good the retrieval API actually is. So far, the rough consensus is like, it's okay, it's decent, it's not the best, but we can talk about that. Another general thing that we launched, which is just like a fun notebook we did, and pretty much like the first hour after this thing released, is OpenAI released like GPTs, which allows you to program custom chat GPTs with natural language. You can basically build this experience if you're a developer, because the way GPTs work is that it's basically just through natural language, you're creating like another agent that does things. And so the thing that like creates this agent can basically be this like meta or builder agent that, for instance, one, sets the system prompt, two, creates an agent, or two, gets the set of relevant tools, and three, creates an agent. So we have like a fun cookbook here that allows you to kind of go in and basically just like set this up yourself from the developer point of view, so that you can basically create like a GPT builder like experience. I know there's no links in any of these slides, but I think I'll probably aggregate. I'll put them into the slides before I send it out in the video recording, and then we'll like all these updates are on our Twitter as well. The kind of like going through some of the last few items. an interesting analysis we've done was basically how good is the GPT-4 Turbo context limit, and specifically on just like very long context, and also comparing it to stuff like Claude. I think there's a bunch of people on Twitter that have kind of like done some basic analysis. Ours is just like a very small portion of this. And so I wouldn't like take the numbers for granted. I would just maybe take a look at the script, see if it makes sense, and then just like use it as just a single data point in your overall like evaluation. I think before this, Greg Hammer did a cool analysis where he basically looked at like the needle in the haystack analysis. To see if GPT-4 could recall context like anywhere in its context window. We took that and just extended it to the summarization case, where sometimes you have documents that are just like way longer than even the context window provided by GPT-4. So the Uber 10K, for instance, has almost 300,000 tokens. We inserted a bunch, like just the specific like random fact of like my favorite snack into the different positions within this overall document. And the thing is, a lot of people are using LLMs for just like large scale summarization these days. And the way they typically do it is repeated sequential LLM calls through these response synthesis strategies, like what we call create and refine, as well as like tree summarize. If you're in the LangChain world, it's called map reduce. They're roughly the thing. Like we've converged on kind of like roughly the same set of strategies for trying to synthesize over longer amounts of context. And it's pretty interesting. It kind of turns out like GPT-4 actually does better than Claude on synthesizing over like long documents and actually finding the relevant information. Like my favorite snack is hot Cheetos. In the middle, like of this document, somewhere through like repeated LLM calls, info tends to get lost. And so basically what this means is that if you're trying to still use GPT-4 for like just massive summarization tasks, you still might want to be a little bit careful in terms of how good it's able to recall like specific piece of information. And the last thing that we just launched around 20 minutes ago is Multimodal RAG. And so we've been hard at work trying to think about the right abstractions for Multimodal RAG. And this is definitely still a work in progress. But if you think about the combination, the launch of like GPT-4 Vision, Fuyu, Lava, like, and a bunch of other kind of like vision-enabled language models that are coming out these days. There's a lot of exciting possibilities and just like taking some of the existing concepts like RAG and agents and just making them multimodal. And so this has a lot of options. Like if you think about the inputs, it could be images or text. If you think about the data representation of your knowledge corpus, it could be images or text, and you can index them via like native image embeddings like Clip, or you could index them via like text embeddings by summarizing the image. And then you can also retrieve images and text and synthesize over image and text. So a lot of different options. We've developed like multimodal indexing and retrieval that integrates with most vector databases, and we'll be developing kind of more native image ingestion pipelines as well. And then given a user query, you can output retrieve images and text. So we just launched this, and there's a full blog post as well. Great. I think that is a rough summary of everything we've done. And so maybe just to answer one question in the chat, parallel processing is natively supported in LlamaIndex without using OpenAI Assistance API. That's a good question. I think right now, do we actually? I think the OpenAI Assistance API basically allows you to do like parallel function calling. And so you can just like get back a plan that is inherently parallel. You can technically replicate this experience in other LLMs as well by just simply prompting it. And we have, like, for instance, we've done some query planning experiments by having like the LLM output some sort of just like JSON spec that contains like a parallel plan or a parallel execution plan. It doesn't work super well though. And so the thing about OpenAI, like by doing parallel function calling, is that because it's just baked into the API, it's kind of fine-tuned to be able to do this well. So that's just the one thing I'll say. And then the last thing I'll answer is, so querying for images makes sense, but what do you mean by actually synthesizing over images? It's a good question. All I mean is just like being able to, take in a retrieve set of text and images, and at a basic level, feeding that into GPT-4b to generate text. Of course, like that's just a very limited current like scope. I think you could imagine some multimodal model that takes in text in and image in, and also text out and image out. as well as there's a lot of these like text to image models too. So we're still kind of playing around with it, and we'll probably come up with more formal abstractions in just a bit. Great. So that's just a presentation of the LlamaIndex update side. And now let's turn it over to the discussion with Dan, the fun part. Okay, cool. So Dan, thanks for coming on. The first
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. The first thing maybe just to start with is I love for you to just do a quick intro about yourself and your journey in AI like the past year. Like when did you get started? Like what have you been working on? Because like I think you know, we've chatted a bunch of times, but like, you know, it's been pretty clear to me you've been a very, very early adopter of pretty much everything exciting that's happened in AI, and so would love for you to share that with the audience.
Yeah, that's a great question. How did I get started? I think like a year and a half ago or something like that around, I just was seeing and hearing rumblings about GPT-3 and was like playing around with the API a little bit and was like, oh, this is kind of cool, but not, you know, I wasn't like hadn't fully dived into it. For context, like I've been running Every for about 3.5 years as a CEO and as a writer. And before that, I ran and sold an enterprise software company. So my background is in starting startups, and then you know, did Every as a kind of like media is a little bit of a pivot for me. So I'm technical. I really like building products, but I also love writing, and so that's how I sort of came to Every. I'd say about a year and a half ago, I started playing with GPT-3. And it really, I think the AI stuff really became a significant interest for me around probably August, September, October of last year. Because we were at Every, we incubated this AI writing app called Lex that my co-founder, Nathan, he was sort of building the first version of it. And the original conception of it was, oh, like maybe we should build a better Google Docs because we spend a lot of time in Google Docs as a company. And there are lots of like little things about it that like we both thought, and I think Nathan in particular thought like could be a lot better. And while we were doing that, we were kind of like, well, it'd be sort of interesting to see what would happen if you just like put GPT-3 in there. And we tried it, and it was like a real like wow moment when it could auto complete what you were writing. And this is, you know, sort of back when those sort of things were like, holy shit, I've never seen anything like that before. And we launched it, and it went really viral. And Lex has gone on to become like, we spun it out as its own company, and Nathan raised a seed round for that from True Ventures. So it's like it's become this like big thing. And I think in that process, I was sort of, I don't know, I was just sort of blown away by the technology. I've been really obsessed with like note taking and tools for thought, and a lot of this software as a creative tool, like a lot of the stuff that I think AI is like really, really good for is like interests that I have and have pursued for a long time. And I think that there's this like, it's a new paradigm that allows you to like make progress in those areas or try different things in those areas that like weren't possible before. And so I just over the last year have done like obsessive amounts of weekend projects or side projects where I'm like building little chatbots or like trying different tools and doing little experiments, and I can go through all the different experiments. But I think that's one of the things I love most about this age is it's so good for tinkerers, where you can spend a couple hours and do something like really, really cool that like no one's done before. And so every time there's something like DevDay, I just get really excited about it to try different things.
Great. That's a great segue into the next question, which is, so yeah, that's given kind of the fact that you've kind of been in the AI space for over a year and built like all these different things and kept like track of all the updates that kind of the LLM space has been putting out. Did DevDay exceed your expectations or fall short? And if the former, like what was the thing that excited you the most? If the latter, like were there things that you were hoping to see, or was it a mix of both?
It's a good question. So yeah, so like I said, I was there on Monday. I wrote a long piece about it, which I just put in the chat 2 days ago, and then I wrote another piece that just came out today. That's sort of another reflection on just generally what's been going on for me. I think like being there, it was truly electric. Like I've never been to a developer conference that had that level of energy and excitement. Like it felt like the Apple iPhone keynote or whatever. And so it just like, I think it was really easy to get swept away. And I definitely was swept away while I was there. It was amazing. I think like reflecting on it now with a little bit of the benefit of hindsight and having written that piece, like where I came to is, I think all the updates are pretty exciting, but they're all basically like incremental to like the paradigms that OpenAI has been like working through for the last like year or so. Like, it's bigger context window. It's like better instruction following and like outputting, JSON or like retrieval. Like it's making a lot of the tasks that developers are already doing a little bit easier. I think the like maybe some of the things that feel a little bit more net new are the assistance API, which feels like it's sort of building this new framework to allow you to make agents easily. And right now, I think the agent functionality is still pretty basic, but you could imagine that being like much more complicated and powerful over time. And then I think the other one is like they're taking another bite at the apple um, at building an app store. They tried it with plugins, did not work. And I think this is the next phase, and I'm like super curious to see how that goes. So I was excited. I mean, I feel like they're delivering the things that people want, which is always good. It's not none of it seems like so groundbreaking that like you couldn't have predicted they would do something like this. But they are consistently, it seems, delivering value. I think like probably some of the stuff they shipped, like you can tell there are some rough edges. You watch people on Twitter right now, like like when they have you can build custom GPTs, and like people have released their custom GPTs, and you can literally anyone can ask the GPT, can you send me the data set that was like that was used to generate this GPT, and it will happily just give you the data. And obviously, like that's just a rough edge that probably you would expect them to have fixed. But I think they're just trying to move like really fast and see what works. And I think that's also commendable.
Yeah, it makes a ton of sense. I was there in person too, and it did kind of feel like an Apple event for what it's worth. Like the marketing, the way they promoted things, it felt very polished. And I would say I think that was the key part in getting people excited, even if there were like rough edges, and we'll talk about that. So starting with GPT-4 Turbo, so 128K context, a lot cheaper. Curious about your thoughts. Like from the developer side, like obviously I can kind of maybe give some thoughts as to how this can benefit the developer experience. Maybe for the average user, like what do you think is the kind of implication of these expanded context windows?
I think like when it comes to something like ChatGPT, like let me thinking just about my dad. He's like, he doesn't really get the whole like, I don't know why I can't upload like a bunch of documents. And like I think a lot of people of his sort of cohort, like who are a little bit non-technical but are interested in this kind of thing, like maybe they're used to using Claude because they're like, oh, I can just put everything in Claude. But I think like expanded context window just like really reduces the level of friction that non-technical people have in like using these types of systems. So that I think that's actually quite a good thing. And I think in general, it opens up even for builders or people who are technical, it opens up a lot of use cases for LLMs, because my feeling for the last year or so has been to some degree the bottleneck for good inference results isn't always like how good the model is. It's actually how good you are at doing retrieval, like how well you can find pieces of information that you're using to like do completions on. Um, and obviously, as you know, like retrieval is a complicated question. There's like so many things that you can do right or wrong in it. And there's so many different like use cases or different types of questions that require different methods to like get better at retrieval. And I think one thing that expanded context windows sort of promise is that retrieval isn't as important, or it doesn't, you don't have to get as complicated as quickly. You can just do something like pretty rough and just throw something in there, and like you might get a decent result even for long context. But as you noted in your presentation, like it seems that like the way that models are currently structured, when you get really long pieces of context, the attention layers like have a tough time with it. It doesn't always work. And so I think like longer retrieval is not this panacea that just like eliminates all those problems, but I think it does make it so that even your most basic calls to the LLMs like have a higher likelihood of working.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think there's kind of like the current state as well as like the promise of like future state of what like just longer context windows and cheaper costs like entail. I think right now there's still some rough edges with like, you know, it might not recall everything in the context window. And so therefore it might forget things, or like it's still pretty expensive and flow to like stuff like 120K tokens. But I think you actually make a really good point in that like the way I think about it is when you think about the performance of an LLM app, there's like some burden on retrieval and there's some burden on the model itself. And right now, there is actually quite a bit of impact in investing in better retrieval because of limited context windows. Whereas, like, if imagine like you have like a few 100,000 to over 1 million tokens in context window, and everything is just super cheap and fast to run, then like the basic retrieval, if you were to do retrieval that you do, could just be something like just set top K to like 200, right? And like the like fancy retrieval algorithms might not actually matter as much if you can just like throw arbitrary things into a context window and synthesize it. So that's a very interesting point. And that's definitely something to keep an eye on as to kind of like how some of the basic use cases evolve and just like kind of get abstracted away by just like doing some basic retrieval as the model complexity gets higher. So the next question that I was gonna ask is, okay, well, I mean, speaking of which, retrieval API. So OpenAI released a retrieval API. Obviously, I think on Twitter on Monday, people were saying like, oh, it's like all the frameworks dead, like all the like vector DBs dead too. Like they have this thing now. I think by all accounts it works okay, but it's not like life changing. But it'll probably get better over time. And I'm curious to get your thoughts on maybe like both from a business as well as like product side, like is this kind of like a future you see where LLM providers just start like hosting the storage, like and just like kind of monetizing that piece too? And do you just see like every LLM start investing in just like better retrieval, like as an addition to their services?
Yeah, like I said, like because the retrieval that you do significantly affects the quality of the output that you get, I think it's like very squarely within OpenAI's interest to make great retrieval. And I think that they are well positioned to do good retrieval because there's good retrieval often requires many different round trips between the like vector store and the vector search functionality and all that logic and the LLM, and having like a tight integration where you both control the LLM and you control the retrieval mechanism like can create good results. I think there are downsides to like a tightly integrated system to that like that. In particular, obviously, like it's hyper model dependent. You're locked into one ecosystem. And I think over time, there's a lot of room for modular, more open source players to do well. But I think for a little while, it seems likely that OpenAI like looks at this as like a important part of what they do, and will start to integrate it more deeply and make it more complicated and make it less basic and less black box and all that kind of stuff. And I think that will like increase the power of your ability to use stuff within the OpenAI ecosystem, which is within their interests. Whether or not like other model providers do the same thing, like Anthropic or like open source models like Llama or whatever for Meta, like I don't know about that. I think I feel pretty safe to say that like OpenAI will do more retrieval. I don't know about other model providers.
Interesting. So some follow-up questions is one is, do you think basically there's going to be like a few different stacks that emerge where like basically you're going to have kind of stuff that is pure vendor lock-in, like everything just lives within kind of like a closed ecosystem? How do you think about like the competitive landscape with, for instance, the rise proliferation of like open source models itself, and basically this it's kind of like just a general mindset of developers like cobbling together various components as opposed to just like using stuff within like one ecosystem. Almost kind of similar to like I'm thinking about a lot of just like cloud-based services, right? Like you just do everything in Azure, or you can like use like different SaaS products and piece together. And I'm curious how you think about that. And then the other thing is like curious to get your thoughts on like the competitive positioning of this versus say like other players in the stack, like especially vector databases. Like how does this like complement compete with those?
Well, so I'm actually very interested in your take on this because I think you're probably better positioned to like analyze the dynamics in the market than I am. But I can take a like a rough stab, but I should say like my confidence interval here is like fairly low. Like I could be wrong. But I think in general, one framework by which to evaluate this is that um, from a competitive landscape perspective, when markets are new and performance is the most important thing for people, having an integrated player that they're doing everything together is likely to win first, because integration allows you to like optimize performance when things are new and things aren't standardized and like you don't really know what's going on. But over time, as things start to get figured out and you sort of like start to asymptote on the performance uh, dimension, and you start to get more other things are more important, like flexibility, cost, security, all that kind of stuff. It becomes more appealing to use more modular players that are optimized for like one specific thing, and you can kind of like piece them together for your specific use case. And so I think there's probably a lot of room for both. I think that OpenAI will probably like be fairly dominant for a while, but as things start to catch up and people start to prioritize cost and flexibility and all that kind of stuff, modular players, and particular like open source players and open source components, I think will have like an important role to play.
Yeah, it's a good point. I think high level, I agree with you in that like if you have just everything integrated and it's just a better experience, then you're going to have an advantage. I think maybe the one caveat here is that I think a lot of companies have tried hosted retrieval. And given the form factor of retrieval, the current retrieval API, it's basically just OpenAI is just trying to solve like retrieval on its own without trying to do some like fancy new architecture. And I think the issue that I think a lot of people are running into is that it's actually quite hard to make it work well and make it generalized across a variety of use cases. And so because it's, I would say that the quality of the retrieval API isn't actually quite at the level of like the magic of like ChatGPT, right? It's actually way below just like, just like the experience of like using the LLM models on its own. Then I think you get less of the integration advantage there. And so I think the issue with kind of building any sort of managed retrieval right now is that like people expect it to work better than what you can get just by using an existing search service or just by doing TopK. And that burden is actually pretty high, especially, and I think a lot of people who have been in the space are basically kind of building like somewhat custom retrieval stacks depending on their data, like custom parsers, chunking, hybrid search, like put it like full text search, that type of stuff, put it into a vector database. And I think it's just like the lower level abstractions give you a bit more control. And I'm sure like eventually people will find out like some of the higher level abstractions that might need to happen in terms of retrieval. But I'd say right now, I don't think like OpenAI has quite solved that yet.
That makes sense. Another way of saying what I think you're saying, you tell me if I'm wrong, is like because retrieval is not one thing, it's a very, very complicated thing that requires that's very customized for like for whatever specific use case you have. Having like an integrated player that sort of gives you like, well, this is our retrieval. You may not get the performance you actually want. Like, and what you really want is a highly customized modular architecture that lets you like push pieces in and out depending on what your use case is.
Yeah, I guess what I'm saying is, yeah, just like the integration advantage is less pronounced when like one of the components actually doesn't work as well. And I think currently the retrieval API doesn't actually solve like a lot of the current use cases. That said, the retrieval API will probably get better. Like I'm fully aware of that. And to your argument, it's kind of like imagine a world where context windows got to like 1 million or 10 million, and the cost just came down, like cost came close to zero. Then you just like who cares if it's not like better than top K retrieval? You just set K to like 1,000 like every time you run the LLM, and then it would probably roughly give you the right context for every question that you ask. And so I think that is actually a pretty interesting feature, and I think what you brought up like got me thinking about that.
Yeah, totally.
Maybe moving on to the next section is GPTs. You talked about it a little bit. OpenAI released this thing kind of as their last feature of the presentation. And they released GPTs with the promise to allow people to program agents with natural language. And there's a few parts of this question, but maybe just like curious to get your thoughts, like what have you already seen people build with GPTs? Like what are some cool use cases that you've seen?
It's a good question. I don't know, off the top of my head, there's this guy, his name is Levels. He was like one of the first guys to do like AI avatars like last year when that was hot. And he runs this thing called Nomad List, which is like a website and community for people who are like being digital nomads. And he just like very quickly built a bot that was like allows you to chat with the Nomad List data set to figure out, okay, like if I want to like live in Amsterdam as a digital nomad, like, how much is it going to cost, or like what's the best place to live for XYZ or whatever. So I think higher level, there are a lot of people out there that like run communities or like for whatever reason have like a small data set that's somewhat proprietary that can like really easily right now just like hook that up to a GPT and like release a little bot for it. And I think that's quite interesting. I do think overall, I'm not particularly bullish on the specific the current GPT form factor. For the reason that I think people only have room for like 1 or 2 chatbots in their lives. And the way that GPTs are currently structured, you can use regular chat GPT, and then if you want to use a specific GPT, you have to like go to this menu and like select it and move out of general chat GPT and then go into this other interface. And I just think that in general, chat is one of those things where it's very hard to predict where you're going to go in a chat, and having to decide, actually, I don't want the full power of ChatGPT with all of its stuff. I only want this very one specific thing. And having to remember that when you're probably only going to use it like once or twice a week is like, it's a really tough sell, I think. That said, I think GPTs if they make some changes to it are quite promising. So like, for example, if I could within the context of any ChatGPT chat, instantiate a GPT temporarily and then uninstantiate it really easily, or have that be done automatically in the way that like it automatically does web browsing. Right. I think all of that would be quite helpful and powerful. And like the idea that I could like with one click upgrade the power of my chat GPT with this niche little thing, I think is super appealing. And I would honestly pay for that. Like it's the equivalent of like buying a book for ChatGPT or buying a course for it. But I just think that they haven't quite figured it out yet.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. I think the having room for 1 to 2 chatbots in your life is a good quote. That might be the tagline for the video. I think high level, I agree. Like the interesting thing about GPTs is it's like expecting people to almost like program an agent to get it to work well for you. And I think I've said this to you kind of like offline, but basically like it's an interesting interface where I feel like the developers are very used to this idea of trying to program something and getting it to work well. But for the average consumer, they probably don't really know what that means. And so as I was looking at the interface where you like effectively what you're doing is you're like setting the system prompt and you're like getting the set of tools and those things. And I wonder if that experience currently is as intuitive to actually for the regular user to create something through natural language versus, as you said, like if everything is just centralized on a single interface, instead of you having to like maintain a bunch of different chatbots and actually trying to understand what does that even mean versus just like having a personalized agent that you can like have a central interface to do different things through. And so I think it's a UX, it's like partially a UX experience as well as like a technical problem to just like see how do you actually, like provide this experience of programming something.
And I think like that's one of the really interesting lessons of this whole era is that the UX makes a significant difference, even when the underlying technology is the same. Like GPT-3 had been out for a long time before ChatGPT came out, and the like significant difference between GPT-3 and ChatGPT is that ChatGPT just made it really easy to use and get the power of GPT-3 out of it. And that's what like launched really the whole like AI boom that's happening right now. And it wasn't about any sort of at that point fundamental advance in the technology because it had been around for a while. It was about packaging it in a way that people could use it. And I think there's probably something similar to be figured out here. It's like they have to figure out the right packaging, and they're inching closer to it, but it's not there yet.
This is a related point, but I think you mentioned offline that OpenAI, and also in your blog post, that OpenAI might be kind of like almost cannibalizing its own developer community a little bit. Like, do you see like it just through offering these like consumer and package experiences? Maybe curious to just get your thoughts. A very general question. Do you see the role of like an AI engineer or developer like expanding or shrinking over time? Like, is it that in the future, like you just actually don't need developers in the middle, or the developers actually still play a crucial role in this new world?
Um, I would be really hesitant to say like you don't need developers. I just think we're so far from that future. I think we're more in a place where people who could never build something previously now can build stuff, and that's really fucking awesome. And people who are developers already can get like 20 to 30% more efficient, or maybe can like work on little projects that they like ordinarily wouldn't have time for because like they don't have to code all of it. And I think that's really exciting. I do think that OpenAI, like, yeah, they are in ways somewhat at odds with some of their developer community. So like, for example, um, there are some competitive dynamics between ChatGPT and the API in the sense that a lot of the things that developers want to build with the API are things that are going to be put into ChatGPT, or are going to be put into the API. So like, they're to some degree competitive with a lot of infrastructure players, there are to some degree competitive with a lot of people um, who are trying to build consumer experiences because it overlaps with ChatGPT functionality. So I think that's like one interesting dynamic that they're going to have to figure out. Like they're caught between being a developer company and being a consumer company. And then I think there's this other thing going on, where to some degree, yeah, they're like commoditizing and consumerizing being a developer. Um, but I just think like we're really far from a place where developers don't matter. That it's just like maybe the day-to-day activities of some developers, it turns out to be like a little bit different than it was before. Like rather than like writing every piece of code by hand, you're like reviewing code. You're like acting more like an engineering manager in certain circumstances. But like, um, it's yeah. I think that's more what we're looking at than you're not doing development work at all.
Yeah, I guess that feature's still a little far off, but
Yeah,
in the short term,
yeah.
yeah, it does seem like a lot of the kind of like wrapper apps are things that eventually just fold back into ChatGPT. So I am kind of curious to see how that goes. Um, and there's like really a question I was going to ask there, but maybe jumping to a question first in the audience. How do you feel that AI developments in a corporate environment will evolve? And the question here is like developing PowerPoint, analyzing Excel sheets, building code in a business environment. Like, do you think it'll be seamlessly AI supported, for example, in a year? And a lot of that seems to be locked into the Microsoft ecosystem right now. And they mentioned like Copilot and also like Office. But yeah, I'm curious to get your thoughts on how these AI experiences will get integrated with these like enterprise applications over time.
That's a great question. I mean, I just like it. It seems really clear that Microsoft is like making a huge investment here, and they've integrated it into Edge. And I've seen Outlook integrations that seem like pretty interesting for people. I've seen Word and PowerPoint integrations, so it's happening. I think it's in with the next version of Windows. So it is happening. And I think one of the things that we've seen is that like if you go back to Slack versus Microsoft Teams, in a world where larger companies have to choose between a product that has a great product experience and a product that they just get for free and is sort of bundled into something they already use and is guaranteed to be secure, like they're going to go for that one. And I think Microsoft has a tremendous advantage there because so many people use Windows and the Microsoft suite that they will be able to release it, and a lot of big companies will use it because that's the thing that is safe and like sort of already approved. And I do think that'll have that will certainly have a massive impact. Like it's a little hard to tell exactly like all the changes that will come from that, but I can see that being yeah, a really big deal.
Do you think maybe just a general question, like value would still accrue, or would all this value accrue to Microsoft, or is there still kind of like AI value accrued to smaller players? And by smaller players, there's a wide spectrum of companies, but below anything Microsoft grade, like even like Slack, which is a big company at this point, all the way down to like the startup that's trying to build like a SaaS, like enterprise AI SaaS product.
Yeah, I mean I really believe in startups. I really do, and I really think that there's this whole narrative going on right now, which is like, AI enables incumbents and they can just sort of bolt it on. And so startups like aren't going to be able to compete in that world because like we're just going to have this super smart, intelligent thing that is like bolted into all these apps. And like, that's just going to make them like able to outcompete any startup. And I think that's just bullshit. Like big companies have like lots and lots and lots of different pressures on them. They're hard to move and they're hard to steer. It's really hard for them to do risky things and they will always fumble the bag. And I think certainly there are going to be things that they can do like GitHub Copilot or like in Microsoft Word or in Outlook or whatever that will like push things forward to some degree. But just for the very fact that they have to make something that works for like 100 million people or 300 million people or whatever, they're not going to be able to do things that someone who's sitting in their garage in Menlo Park is willing to do. They just can't risk it. And I think those same dynamics exist in this AI world that we're in, that have existed in every single other era of technology. I have no reason to believe that that's different, and therefore I just think that there's a ton of opportunity. I just don't think that we know what that is yet, because we haven't like envisioned the new way of doing things with AI yet that like that a big company can't do. Yeah,
that's probably a good point. Next, shifting to one of the major feature releases in the OpenAI Dev was the release of GPT-4v API, and then. I mean, the consumer app has been out for a while, and I think a lot of people have already been playing around with it. I'm curious, like, have you seen like cool use cases for multimodal that like, are you starting to see some stuff like that emerge? Like you were actually just telling me about some of the stuff that you were doing. And I think for a lot of users, it actually would be cool to just like hear about the stuff you've done, because I think people are still trying to figure out like, what do I actually do with this thing?
Yeah, I use it for a lot of stuff. I love the multimodal stuff. So one thing I use it for is reading. So for example, right now I'm reading Moby Dick, and Moby Dick is like, it's a book that well, I have it right here. Like, first of all, it's really thick. And it's like text wise, it's incredibly dense, and the text is written in like sort of an old style of English where there's words and phrases and references that like I just don't get, right? And it's the kind of book that ordinarily I honestly, even though I would love to read it, I would honestly need to like sign up for like an English class to read it, because like I just don't have the context to like get the most out of it. But I'm not going to sign up for an English class to read Moby Dick. Like I'm past that point in my life, unfortunately. But the incredible thing about multimodal is, as I'm reading, I can just take a little picture and be like, "Hey, can you translate this to modern English?" And it just like takes that like dense thing that I don't quite get, and it just like renders it for me in a way that I totally understand. And once I do that a few times, I sort of get the text in my ear a little bit more, and I don't have to do it as much because I like kind of have the foundation of like, okay, this is what that word means and all that kind of stuff. And what's even cooler is once I get the little translation, I can also be like, hey, can you just render a scene like this in Dolly? And it just like shows me, I can like see Moby Dick for myself, and that just like makes it more vivid and more engaging. Like it's such a cool thing, and I think it works it works better for books that are like Moby Dick that are old and famous and are open like open copyright because GPT-4 has read it, whereas like a new book, like it probably doesn't have. And so yeah, I think it's incredibly good for that. And in general, is really good for putting things into words that you don't have words for, which for me, I'm a writer, like that's a big thing for me. So I love just like walking around and like taking a picture of a building and being like, can you describe this for me? Because I want to know like what are the words for like the way that this building looks or like the little ornament on it or whatever. Like and so yeah, I think being able to translate images into words is like a huge deal.
To me, it seems like it shortens the like one of the powerful things about LLMs in general is just shortening time to value to any sort of insight from your data. Like you just dump in like a random amount of text, then you can like ask questions over it, get a summary, that type of thing. Try to write new text, and this seems to ease that barrier even more because like you don't have to actually have stuff in a pure text representation. You can just take a picture of the world. And these days, mobile phones make it very easy to just like snap a picture of anything. And then you can immediately basically just observe things through that. Right?
Yeah, totally.
Um, I think the related question from the audience, and I might actually just take this, is have you guys tried using GPT-4b for document AI or extracting parse data from documents or PDFs? How good is it? Is it too pricey? I mean, I think currently, yes, it's very rate limited and it's going to be a little pricey. But in general, I think that is one of the open questions we're very interested in exploring, which is, can you actually use the vision models for document AI in worlds where you would traditionally use stuff like text parsing and LLMs? And so basically, how much of a replacement can or complement can like vision models be to just like, snap a screenshot of a piece of text, chart, table, instead of relying on like a PDF parser and basically in parallel trying to like synthesize insights from that, right? And it seems to me there'll probably be a mix of both. Like, I mean, there's so many tokens that are allowed within the context window. It'd be kind of dumb to not use text, but at the same time, if you could supplement it with like images or screenshots or stuff from like a web page or document, I think there's a lot of interesting like opportunities and trade-offs there, especially as both of these models get better. Maybe the last thing just kind of to chat about is like around agents. I think you mentioned there you wrote a little bit about this in your blog post covering the DevDay releases, but like given the assistant API, it seems like OpenAI is building some sort of like hosted agent interface under the hood. How do you think like this and curious to get your thoughts and happy to have like a discussion on this too. I'm just trying to think about some of the things that I'm trying think of some like concrete insights here is like how do you like releases like this where OpenAI is basically hosting the agent under the hood affect like how developers will build with agents slash like how maybe the agent ecosystem will evolve like over time. For instance, I think pre the release of this, like most people building agents are just like hacking around some basic like loops, like a React loop or function calling loop within their own code. But it seems like stuff like this means that, hey, OpenAI is like, don't worry about that. Just call us through an API. We'll figure it out under the hood and we'll give you back something, right?
Yeah.
And curious in your mind, like whether more and more agents will kind of just be owned, that execution loop will be owned by the LLM versus the just like developer writing their own stuff.
I think it's pretty clear there's always going to be a group of hardcore people that want to own the whole stack and do something really powerful. And there's also a lot of value in having this sort of like out of the box thing where you don't have to worry about a lot of the details and you can just do an agent for a new use case. So I think both will be true. And I think also just having a strong default in the ecosystem where it's like, if you want to build an agent, like it's really easy is quite helpful. And it seems like, pretty central to the OpenAI core roadmap to create a system that can, given a task, go accomplish it without you having to know how or what it did. And so this is the like this is the first building block of that whole system.
Mhm.
And yeah, it seems very important. Like, will we not, use that anymore? I think it's sort of like one way to think about it is people still code in assembly sometimes. It's like way more rare than it was 40 years ago.
It's more rare though, right? No, not everybody codes in assembly now.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like, not everyone does, but some people do.
Mhm.
And so I think some people will always be doing that. But I think, like, I don't know, in 20 years, like, it seems likely that what we're doing now will look like the equivalent of programming in assembly, and there will be like a bunch of layers of abstraction on top of it that
Sure.
and what OpenAI is doing with the agent API is like the next layer of abstraction. And I think that is probably makes sense.
Interesting. So similar to how I guess like programming languages, like I don't know, like TCP, IP, like whatever, like basically any sort of abstraction stack that you can think of, like there will be kind of more and more things built on top to abstract away the complexity of the bottom two layers.
Yeah, totally. And I think
Interesting.
a good question to ask is like, who has the right to build that those abstraction layers, and is it better for it to be a like an integrated player, or is it better for it to be open source, and what will deliver better performance and customizability and all that kind of stuff? And I think history of software is like both happen, and sometimes the like integrated players are better, and sometimes the open source stuff is better. But it's an interesting question. I don't know.
Sweet. Okay, I think that's a good stopping point actually. Dan, thanks so much for coming on the webinar. I think you had a lot of great
Of
insights
course.
and also cool quotes I could just use as like taglines. And so thanks everybody for joining and hope you enjoyed the discussion. I'll see you guys next time.
Thanks for having me. This is great.
Of course.